This is the pre-debate session of Stand With Maine. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Roger Cates. I'm a member of Stand With Maine. I'm a former mayor of the city of Augusta and served 4 terms in the legislature. I just wanted to say that during those 8 years I was at the State House, I really got to see and have a front row seat to the influence and the corroding influence of big money in our politics, in our public policy, and also in our sense of community here in the state of Maine. And what it was mostly outside money, outside the state of Maine, from wealthy individuals and organizations that were doing a couple things. First was trying to elect candidates, Maine candidates. Secondly was trying to affect our referendum process. And third was trying to affect public policy in the legislature. And one thing I came to realize over those 8 years was this really isn't a party issue at all. And that's what's so empowering about this. I happen to be a Republican, but whether the money is coming from the Koch brothers on one side or George Soros on the other, or from large corporations on one side or labor unions on the other, it really is the same effect. It is taking the conversation away from Maine people and putting it in the hands of large out-of-state donors. And Exhibit A is no further away than your TV screen, where if you were watching the evening news right now, you would be seeing sub-news, but you would also be seeing a barrage of ads in our US Senate race on both sides. And they do have one thing in common. Most of them paid for by out-of-state money, both individuals and organizations. It wasn't as much of a problem before the Citizens United case. And that's what's really just opened up the field to where anything goes now. But the Citizens United case from the Supreme Court didn't end the discussion, because there is a solution to getting some handle on this again. And that is the prospect of a constitutional amendment. Stand With Maine is a very Maine-specific grassroots effort that is working with an organization called American Promise, which is a national organization led by the way, by someone who has very deep Maine roots, Jeff Clement, that we may hear from later. And our whole purpose in being is to build support for this constitutional amendment that we hope that the United States government will be taking up before too long after the election. So tonight, well, before tonight, we've had a number of calls, and we've had leaders from conservation, leaders from environmental groups, and civic voices. And tonight, we're going to discuss this issue from a very different perspective, from how pay-to-play impacts Maine businesses, and particularly Maine-grown and small businesses. The first half of our hour tonight is going to be a conversation with Karim Durdaj, I think I pronounced that correctly, the president of Great Works International here in Maine. And when you think about Maine entrepreneurs, this is exactly who we're talking about with this gentleman. I'll add that Edie Smith, who's state director for Senator Angus King, I believe is listening in and representing the senator, who has been a real champion for getting money out of politics and making sure that these conversations and these debates are between Mainers, not between large out-of-state interests. So here to introduce our special guest is Betsy Peters, one of our American Promise chapter members, who's very, very friendly with our guest. Betsy?
Thanks, Roger, and thanks for your support. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to introduce my dear friend, Karim Durdaj. He's a passionate leader of people and companies and causes. And his list of accomplishments in life and business are long, so I'll curtail myself to the highlights. He's currently the president and chief operating officer of Great Works Internet, as Roger said, and it's a leading New England ISP and telecommunications company based in Maine that's just recently been reestablished, as a B Corp. And under Karim's leadership, they've become a corporate practitioner of conscious capitalism with a relentless focus on open access, net neutrality, data privacy, and a commitment to expanding future-proof fiber networks to every corner of the state. During the 25 years prior to GWI, he led 3 other technology and manufacturing companies through startup to either acquisition or IPO. And he gives generously of his time, energy, and investment dollars as a Maine angel and as the new head of a new microloan fund for immigrants here in Maine. He's a dedicated husband, father, and friend, and a talented poet and writer and speaker. So I'm very thrilled to have him here tonight, and I will hand the mic back over to Roger to kick it off. And thanks, Karim.
Thank you, Betsy. Very kind words. Very
Thanks
kind.
so much. So Karam, welcome. I think we're talking to you from beautiful downtown Scarborough. Is that right?
Yeah, the downtown, uptown, Scarborough is a little bit of a mess when it comes to urban planning. So somewhere in Scarborough, yes. Zoning planning been thrown outside the window for a while.
Okay. So Karim, tell us, if you could, what interests you about the Stand with Maine campaign and what drew your interest in this organization?
Well, you know, I think part of the foundational element of society is, I believe, are 3 things within the context of Stand with Maine and Stand with America. One is the transparency of available information. The second is how that information actually empowers society at large, and then translating to a respect of the societal contract. And for me, that's a continuum. And if, especially in today's age, given the velocity of information that is sort of pinging around, and the abuse and the disinformation that results from that, I think efforts like Stand with Maine and Stand with America, Promise America, are elementally important to protecting what it means actually to be a human being and what it actually means to be a society. To some extent, these conversations that we are having today have been going on for fairly long millennia. The function of democracy, how does it function? What are some linkages that it has to policy, to human empowerment, human realization? So these are not new conversations, but I do believe that there's an inflection point in the 21st century because of the rapidity of the information that's been transmitted. I don't think that's ever happened before, especially not on a global scale. And there are 2 big tectonic events that are happening that are, I believe, an existential question, which efforts like this, I think, can try to address in its own way as part and parcel of an adventure. And those 2 elemental questions for me, existential questions for me, are: there's a massive economic divide. It's massive. It exists. It's not in the United States. It exists in every country. And that is deep, far, and wide, and it needs to be addressed. Otherwise, it will essentially unhinge what constitutes civilization. And the other one is climate change. And how does policy that translates without the influence of what I would call undue input points, how does that policy that works for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years on a generational basis help us solve these questions? Because the truth of the matter is, existential questions cannot be solved by thinking in terms of profit loss. They cannot be solved simply in terms of thinking who wins or who loses, the zero-sum game. They cannot be solved in terms of it's me and it's you. So, and these things get influenced by money. And there's some intentional good money and there's some intentional not so good money. And how does one sort of parse that out and create policy or constitutional amendments? You know, that's an interesting, it's an interesting data point. In the Constitution, it says that post offices should be funded. There's a reason for that. The reason is that the founding fathers said people should get information, and those are post offices. In order for information to disperse itself and for the democratization of that information, it is in the Constitution that we're going to fund them. Now, it just so happens, because the Constitution said the post office should be funded, roads were actually created to join those post offices. Now, those roads essentially created infrastructure. Those roads from way back then now delineate geographies, economies, socioeconomic demographics. I mean, think of the impact, right? Just from that. And I think questions like this have an interesting like generational spread.
So let me talk about infrastructure. I want to concentrate a little bit on your area of infrastructure, which is broadband access. And you've been up at the State House a lot. You were there a lot when I was there.
Absolutely, we did some good stuff together.
What have you seen in your own part of the world in terms of the impact of money on public policy affecting your industry?
It's enormous. So the internet infrastructure, or the telecommunications infrastructure, is essentially civilization for the 21st century. If you took a map of the United States and said, who are the internet providers or telecommunication providers, the country very neatly carves itself out into 6 players. It's interesting. There's no overlap. There's no competition with each other. It literally carves itself out. AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, Cox, Frontier, and Charter. It's interesting. Now, if you think about it, why did that happen? That happened actually starting from way back when electric poles were actually put up. If you remember the rural electrification program, that said we're going to get electricity. So the poles got put up. When the poles got put up, they were owned by the utilities and other private companies. Now, fast forward, you go through the interstate highway system in the 50s, you get into the 80s and 90s, and things get deregulated, right? So you have these companies that owned large chunks and did deals with the utilities, and they now owned the infrastructure. And then they decided that we're not going to compete with you because we're a monopoly, right? So let's be happy, we'll be monopolies and incumbents in our own spaces. So think about it. 330 million Americans are at the behest of 6 companies.
Right. And your company is trying to fit into this group of 6.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And in terms of public policy, say at the Maine legislature, what role has money, you've been an observer, what role does money from these larger behemoths play in your ability to get your message across?
Well, one very, very simple way is that they actually have lobbyists that try to write the laws and forward that to the legislatures. Roger, as you well know, there's massive complexities to telecommunications, right? So who goes on the pole? Imagine 21st century infrastructure is actually still going to get strung on poles in the main. Whatever we do or you do or whoever does it, it will live for the next 100 years. So there's lots at stake. So you have lobbyists that come in and actually pre-package a policy and saying to the legislature, this is in your best interest, here it is, sponsor it and bring it to vote. That's a massive sublimation of the responsibility the legislature has, right? But there's only 24 hours in the day. There are many other bills, and they're getting bombarded left and right. So they say, oh, sure, that makes sense. I'll go for it. Not realizing the price that they're paying, which is the lack of choice, the lack of reliability, the lack of robustness, and frankly, the lack of the consumer voice. So for example, one way we try to sort of asymmetrically do this is we're maniacal about net neutrality. So we work with the legislatures and say, any infrastructure that's publicly funded, et cetera, should be net neutrality champions. Got that push, but boy, did they fight hard on that one because it's not in their interest, right? Then we said, we want to empower the consumer with data privacy and security rights. So we work with legislatures like Aaron Herbig and all those good people, got that passed. Well, the state of Maine got sued. They got sued. Now, the state of Maine said, fine, bring it on, let's go. And that's fine. So it settled itself out. But the thing is, you have these huge companies that hate being competitive. They absolutely hate it. It's not in their interest to say to the society at large, saying, I actually like competition. So what they do is they spend an inordinate amount of time, money, energy, but more importantly, these deals that they make at such a high level at the federal level. So for example, the definition of broadband at the federal level is 25 by 3, 25 down, 3 up, which is actually ridiculous. There are actually branches of the government which define it as 10 by 1. 10 by 1. That's Right? So Angus, God bless his soul, and I wish if he had the time he should pop in over here, because I always have this track record of having conversations, and he always pops in. So it's always great to have that. But he's been fighting this valiant fight with us, valiant fight about trying to redefine what actually broadband is, and it should be 100 by 100.
And you're at a disadvantage because you're a little guy with the big money. By the way, I just want to repeat again, people have questions for a little later, and won't be too long now.
Sure.
Please press the Q&A function on the lower bar of your screen. Type in your question, and Azar is going to be collecting them and screening them and asking them pretty shortly. So let me ask you this. If it were possible to reasonably limit the money that gets spent in Maine elections and in Maine referenda, what impact do you think that would have on your ability to compete in the public square and public policy issues with those six big guys?
It'd be like somebody flipped a switch on and said, let's go, and say, let's compete in an open, equal marketplace. It's not equal right now. It's far from equal. There's a reason why, communities that are economically disenfranchised don't have good infrastructure, because it's not in the interest of the behemoths to do anything about it. There's a reason why they get 80, 90, $100 billion over the last 10 years, say they're building infrastructure, they disappear, and then they ask for more. So the issue becomes, if that amount of influence is either lessened or sidelined, public policy then truly becomes public policy. I mean, you are the expert, right? So I am a student of policy. I'm a student of history. But the rationale that public policy exists is basically rooted in the fact you're trying to do good on a societal scale. You're trying to do it equivalently and in an egalitarian way. And you're trying to do it in a way that's sustainable. None of those things happen when you have money in the middle of it, especially if you have large swaths of money in the middle of it, especially when it's at the federal level and state level.
Well, let me ask you about the federal and the state level. And why is it that legislators in Maine or senators or congressmen in Washington hear disproportionately from those large companies and not so much from you guys?
It's a question of how many soldiers can you throw at the wall, right? So GWI works closely with the congressional staff. But that's with me and my business partner, Fletcher, who's the founder of GWI. That's two human beings working around the clock, communicating with 4 congressional staffs. Imagine if you had 10, 20. That's very different. That's an order of magnitude different in terms of trying to have conversations, writing papers, saying here is a white paper, here is data, here is research, right? Even though it's all, pardon the expression, all bullcrap. But they can bury people with disinformation. And that's where it separates itself. The little guy, and we're little, but the little guy has an issue of how to get above the fray in a way that's sustainable, right? So we belong to certain industry associations and we collaborate on getting that information out. But these big guys, they don't need an industry association. They got people all over the country. And so it's very easy for them to say, let's jam the system up, right? So when a bill comes, and Angus, God bless his soul again, right? So he will have bills, or he'll sponsor bills. He'll ask our input. So we'll say, okay, you know what? Here are some things that we need to think about for the citizens of Maine. It's amazing what the other side then will try to do. It's disinformation upon disinformation on disinformation round the clock. And so what that happens is it changes the narrative. It changes the conversation. And Roger, you just don't pass a bill on your own. You have to get co-sponsors. You have to get other people to buy in. That conversation spins out of control very quickly. And now you have colleagues who are saying, well, actually I heard, or another colleague saying, well, actually somebody said that. And now you have to address their questions. Now you just lost a thread. And so that's the problem. It becomes a distraction. It becomes a complete sort of a bifurcation of what is true and what is false.
Yeah, and I don't have any figures on this, but I suspect, and you have seen, that contributions, particularly to U.S. Senate campaigns and to congressional campaigns, you are vastly outspent by the big guys within your industry. Even collectively, your smaller companies are outspent.
Yeah, and we don't contribute. We contribute with our time and energy, not with our money. Our time and energy is worth its weight in gold. So, and I think to some extent, I think the congressional staff respects that, realizes that, and reciprocates that, right? So when we have a conversation with them, they understand what the context is of that conversation. We are a B Corp. We are responsible for our vendors, our stakeholders, our community, our environment, and our vendors and our employees. So, so the consumer is at the middle of every decision that we make, and they know that. So the question for them becomes is how do they balance that against all the other stuff that's coming over the transom at them? And they have so many hours in the day too.
Right.
And so the conversation then pollutes, not because of them, not because of us. It just pollutes because of the volume of stuff coming into them as disinformation.
Can you give us an
that's-
idea? Let's take the subject of net neutrality. I got to confess that even having had studied it for some time,
Yeah.
please don't ask me exactly what it is because I won't be able to.
Sure.
But in any event, at a federal level, what are the economic consequences to companies of net neutrality being passed into law versus net neutrality not being passed into law? What's at stake for the larger companies and for other companies like yours?
What's at stake is larger companies can give preferential rights to whoever they want. They can charge however they want. And that essentially creates an unfair market space for the consumer. Why should a consumer have to be given lesser preference rights than somebody else? Why should they get charged for it? That's the reason why net neutrality is an absolute must, because it levels the playing field.
Okay. We'll talk about leveling the playing field. If Citizens United didn't exist, or if this amendment passes and Congress on the national level and Maine on a state level could put into place reasonable limits on campaign spending and contributions, how would that affect the ability of you and your colleagues to be able to fight this battle on net neutrality as an example?
Well, in Maine, as you know, right, so 77% of all businesses are 20 employees or less. So the GDP of Maine is like 48.6 billion. That's a pretty healthy chunk. So imagine the economic wealth that gets created when all those businesses are unfeathered and are part and parcel of an equal playing field, where the ability of them to manufacture a product or make a product or deliver a service is done on the basis of that product and service, not on the basis of fighting call it a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is essentially incentivized not to do anything except protect their self-interests. Think of the economic wealth that generates, the jobs that gets created, the taxes that they pay. Now the question doesn't become, oh, should we tax and spend? The question that becomes is, how do you prudently grow for the next generation? How do you create an extra dollar from each business? How do you create an extra job? Those are significantly different conversations than the block and tackle those 77% of the businesses in Maine have to do on a day-to-day basis, right? So businesses, there's 140,000 businesses in Maine. So 77% is close to like 110,000 of them. That's a stinking big number. So think of the lever that they have. And that's the way I think of it. The lever on the individual businesses is actually very large when they're part and parcel of a large community. And when you have the influence of money sort of sidelined, that lever becomes very large from an economic development point of view. Now you have private capital that would come in because they see the opportunity. Now you have social impact capital that come in that will see the opportunity. You have the consumer going, you know what? I'm going to buy from you because you have my best interest at heart. And oh, by the way, now I see you because before I couldn't see you because there was all this noise. So
well, I can tell you that we're going to turn over to Azer in just a second, Deirdre, because I think you have struck a nerve. I know the questions are flooding in. So I'm going to turn things over now to Azer Cole, who is our state director for the organization American Promise, who's going to go through a few of those with you. If you
Sure.
around.
Sure.
Azer.
Super. Well, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Karem, for joining. I've been enjoying this conversation so far. And as people are thinking of questions, again, use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I've got a question. One of the things that we sometimes find in talking with businesses is there's always a series of careful calculations that go into being outspoken about an explicitly political issue. But sometimes when thought of, well, we're speaking out about an issue that impacts the values that as businesses we hold dear. My question, Khurram, is for you in thinking about this big issue that we're talking about of how money in politics impacts society and specifically how it impacts Maine businesses. What are some of the core values that you immediately think of when you think of what we're trying to accomplish here?
You mean the values of American Promise? I'm just trying to clarify.
The values that if we were to succeed would be heightened, would be able to be led with, that we currently struggle to achieve.
I think that value would be to be fair to each other. And fairness and kindness tends to be squishy, loosey-goosey words, which I don't think they are. But in today's economy, every transaction historically tends to be monetary. We tend to reject that. The transaction is not monetary. The transaction is actually something that one company or one entity like a Maine company or a Maine human being like myself does with the other. It's not just an economic transaction. It's a transaction that carries with it the trust that I have your best interests at heart, and what I am giving to you, for which it has value that you're reciprocating with, is going to last, that it's robust, it's reliable, and the price that I'm asking for it is fair. And oh, by the way, 6 months from now, I'm not going to screw you by increasing that, right? Or if tomorrow you go and say it doesn't work, I'm not going to say, oh, well, I tried, a best effort, right? I'm going to say, no, I screwed up. I'm going to get it right, and I'm going to get it right the way I have it on this piece of paper. So the fairness and kindness, I truly, truly, truly believe that in the Maine ecosystem exists. Part of it is history. If you look at the history of Maine, even though it's been very tumultuous, right? The core DNA, the work ethic, is foundationally based on fairness and kindness, right? Even if we say that it's been buffeted, it should evolve, there have been many trials and tribulations, wrong directions, but at the end of the day, the Maine ecosystem is governed by, hey, you know what? It snows 6 months of the year. We really can't afford to be dinks to each other. So we got to get along with each other. It's that kind of an environment. And so that's where it separates itself, because when you have money coming into the play, it's awfully, awfully hard to be fair and kind, because you're essentially not incentivized to be that, which is why we're a B Corp, which is why we believe in conscious capitalism, because I believe the Milton Friedman days, of defining what it means to be a company, they work well, they work all right, but it's a brand new day. And the brand new day is essentially determined by consumer advocacy. The consumer is at the center of things because a consumer is human society. And that human society has dependencies now with the immense economic gap and the climate change issues. The only way we're going to get over that is by actually being a society. And what does being a society mean? We are in social contract with one another. And that social contract is determined by, okay, you have to be truthful to me. So it means that we have to be vulnerable, which we can be. It also means we have to intentionally say, you know what? I am not going to be part and parcel of doing any kind of business with any entity that doesn't share my values. It's awfully hard to do. It's awfully hard to do, especially when you don't have that choice, but you have to create that choice. So you bang on the drum and you say, no, I want choice. I want choice. And whoever answers that bell, and I bet you out of the 140,000 companies in Maine, 140,000 companies will answer that bell. Now you get the game going. Now you get the ball moving. The ball doesn't move if it's only 10 companies or 20. It moves when the entire society then levers it, in my opinion, in my humble opinion.
No, thank you for that answer. I mean, you're able to articulate sort of the big ideas and how they interrelate with the small sort of minutia that we're talking about in a way that is unique, that I haven't heard so clear so far. And we've got a couple questions here. I'm going to ask this from Edie Smith on behalf of Senator King. Roger, this might be a question for you, but just talking about the difference between working towards disclosure and increased transparency, which certainly is only a good thing. We want to know where money being spent is coming from. But how is that different from what we're trying to do in a constitutional amendment, actually limiting the amount of money that can be coming into the political process? And why is that an important distinction for people to understand? This is from Edie Smith on behalf of Senator King.
I'll give a crack at that. First of all, this has been terrific, Karem. Really appreciate all of your insights. Transparency and disclosure are important, and they are good things in and of themselves. But the ability of the average person to have the time to really dig into those disclosures and figure out where the money is really coming from, assuming you have a job and a family and other things going on in your life, is fairly limited. And I'll give you an example. If you take a look at ads that are on television now, you'll see that they're paid for, I'm going to make up the name, by Citizens for a Better America, whatever. That tells you nothing. And then if you want to dig down deep and see, well, who is funding Citizens for a Better America, you'll see that it'll be, their big contributors will be Americans for a Better Way, and Americans for a Better Life, and Americans for Fairness and Equality. So to be able to dig down and really understand exactly who is giving the money is almost a full-time job in itself. So disclosure is important, transparency is important, but that doesn't solve the problem, because that transparency will still allow the wealthy individuals from New York and California, the big corporations from all over, the labor unions from all over, to be able to continue to pour that money into the state of Maine, to the point where I can't remember what the latest statistic I saw was, but a huge percentage of the money, and again, I'm going to use the US Senate race as an example on both sides, a huge amount of that money is coming from outside of the state of Maine. A lot of that is coming from 2 or 3 different states. And no amount of disclosure law, which is all good, will really solve that problem.
Yeah, we get that question a lot all over the country. You know, what is disclosure enough? And well, most Americans sense that the system is rigged. And if you shine a light on a list of, you know, the 10 billionaires contributing to your political elections, all right, you shined a light on it, but it's still broken. So it's one thing to shine a light on something that's broken, and it's another thing to work to fix it. We've got an interesting question here from a chapter member, Henry Laughlin, and he's wondering, it looks like about the geographic impacts. What big money effects are there in terms of businesses coming to Maine, encouraging professionals to move to the state, or maybe vice versa, encouraging businesses in some instances to relocate elsewhere? I think that's an interesting question. Karem, is that anything that you've seen or a dynamic you can speak to?
A little bit. So there's definitely been I would say, a necessary, needed, vital, and exciting influx of professionals, I would say, from the East Coast corridor coming to Maine. And this is pre-pandemic, so I don't think it's, you know, after the pandemic, there's a different sort of dynamic at play. But pre-pandemic, there has been, and there will be. There's some good work being done by Live and Work in Maine and a whole bunch of other institutions in Maine. So that's happening, and I think the reason why it's happening is at least ad hoc. So I'm fortunate enough that I get 10, 15 calls a week, people saying, I heard, I want to do something. What do you got? Who should I talk to? So Betsy and I do that a fair amount. We're like the local telephone exchange once in a while. So, but, and the reason is they have heard that Maine is actually a good place from a quality of life, education system, and a place where one can self-actualize without the burden of undue expectations placed by the hierarchies, right? So People can come over here, start a business, and they're judged on the merits of that rather than who they knew, when they knew, and did they keep up with the Joneses. So I think there's that, especially when you're looking at an age demographic that's say 25 to 40, where people want to start a new family over here. They may have had some linkages from the past, from their childhood. So that's definitely happening. In terms of businesses, I think that happens. But I don't think there is a constant sort of critical mass coming over here. And that's okay. If there are larger companies that want to move, and that happens every once in a while, they're doing that intentionally because they want to take advantage of the workforce and they want to take advantage of the quality of life. But the important thing is at the end of the day, it's all governed by the brand of Maine. It is. And the brand of Maine is it's a great place to raise a family. It's a great place to be and not worry about traffic and breathe in fumes. So, but what I suspect is also valuable is it should sort of tack us off by saying it's also a great place where the values you have as a human being are holistic and 360, so that in business, at work, at home, with friends, colleagues, peers, you're the same person. You're always the same person. And that DNA reflects itself in a multiplicity of areas without you feeling, you know what, I'm acting or I got a mask on. And I think that is immensely valuable. It just so happens it translates to, again, human society and the way we transact, right? If I am being completely transparent and honest, and I am the same person where if I'm sitting at my work desk or if I'm sitting in a coffee shop or I'm sitting with a consumer or I'm sitting with a business owner, you know what? It's a lot easier. It's a lot more truthful. And frankly, a lot of magical things then happen. So I think if we can sort of use this opportunity, because we are at that inflection point, if we can use this opportunity to create that narrative, again, the whole desire to create economic wealth that is dispersive and closes that divide, now again, you have magical things happen. Instead of a $48.6 billion GDP, you'll have a $100 billion GDP. Again, think of all the stuff you can do with that. Not everything that comes from the outside is bad. Not at all. It's a question of context. Really is a question of context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, context is everything. One thing that this question makes me think of is, one impact of this big money system that is so easy to participate in is national interests see Maine as a state with competitive elections and a relatively small population. Getting to Roger's earlier point, among Maine's congressional races this year, among the top 5 states that are directly contributing to candidates, less than 25% of the money is coming from sources inside of the state of Maine. So that's one of the geographic impacts that we're seeing here. This is something that people are rightly fired up all over the country about in the business community and being part of this solution. And I'll just add that there's a national business network that American Promise is building, which sharing this video with the national community will be a big service to show, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. And one more example why we should follow Maine's lead. Roger, I've got a question for you, as I know there's a rich legislative history of progress on this very amendment in Maine. Can you touch on the work that the legislature did in 2013 directly in support of this constitutional amendment?
Right. And of course, I think it's fair to say that things have only gotten worse since 2013. But back then, it was my second or third year in the legislature, I think, and there was a resolution proposed in the Maine legislature to essentially endorse the adoption of a constitutional amendment to essentially overturn Citizens United. And everybody got it, so to speak. It passed in both houses overwhelmingly. And I think Maine may have been the first legislature to actually weigh in on the subject as a legislature. Since then, a number of other states have done so. And I think in the next session, Maine will be asked to do it again, just to reaffirm that. And you talk, and I think that Karem was talking about the the main ethic, I think part of the main ethic is exactly that, is that we want to make our own decisions here. There's only 1,000,003 of us. We can have conversations, we can talk to each other, and we can debate these issues ourselves. And not only don't we need this outside noise coming in, we really don't want it. We want to keep those decisions internally in Maine. And Republicans get that, Democrats get that, Greens get that, Independents get that. I think that's why it passed so overwhelmingly in 2013. And I know if it comes up again, it will do the same.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's something that is a powerful message that a cross-partisan majority of state legislators see this as a problem, see a constitutional amendment as the foundational solution, and a huge part of Stand with Maine is fulfilling that promise and making sure that Congress is doing what's in its power to speed up passage of an amendment out of Congress and back out to the states for ratification. Just a huge service that work has been done, and now we can work to fulfill it. We've got a question here from Jane Gallagher, who's the co-leader of the American Promise Maine chapter. And she says, and Karim, maybe I'll pose this to you, are there other ways that you see money in politics impacting the business world in Maine outside of the telecommunications industry?
Well, I mean, let me think of the various sort of larger sectors, right? So you have a fair amount of outside capital coming for, and it's necessary, a fair amount of capital come from the aquaculture sector. And I think that's good capital. I think that's wise capital. There is a fair amount of investment dollars coming in, and Betsy's, we work in this sort of in the same ecosystem where startups are funded. There are now various linkages between Maine capital and call it Northeast capital, right? Boston, Vermont, New Hampshire, and those are good things. Again, it's a question of context. I think where it gets squirrely is when you have large movements of capital that's sort of unaccounted for. Certainly happens in the telecommunications industry. But I suspect if I thought about it, I'm sure in the other economic sectors, you will find that. But for example, a source of good capital is, right? You have 2 large semiconductor fabs actually in South Portland. That is outside capital. Those are large companies that employ a crap ton of people, good jobs. Those are good companies. And that's a lot of capital they've deployed into Maine. So bravo to them. Good job. Are those the kind of companies that, again, sustainable, they invest in the Maine ecosystem, the Maine workforce over and over and over again? Can we keep on finding that? The other alternative is you got to grow that from inside. So you have companies like IDEX that are Maine bred. You have companies like WEX, Maine bred, Covetrus, Maine bred. Those are all companies that started like a little peep out of an idea, now are public companies. So we can do that also. One is not at the expense of the other.
I also think there's a good example in educational technology. When you look at competency-based learning, that was definitely outside influences targeted Maine because we're a small state. We were the first with one-to-one laptops, thanks to Angus King. But we also got targeted to have some pretty radical social experiments and money, big money from the Gates Foundation, et cetera, targeted Maine for that.
Super. And I believe Amy Cartmell, the other co-leader of the Maine American Promise chapter here, who you'll hear from an extended period of time in a couple minutes here, has a question for the panel as well.
Yes, and this might be for both Roger and Karim. And Karim, I was just thinking back to something you said a few minutes ago, which I was surprised to hear, even though it might be naive of me, and that was how when possibly legislation is coming up, and I assume you were talking about on a national level, that the players, so to speak, will start to cram information in possibly ahead of the folks who are trying to make sure that their legislators get accurate information with potentially all kinds of misinformation. So that was interesting to me, because we're hearing so much right now these days about social media and all the misinformation that's out there. And so this was the first I was hearing about this kind of thing. It almost sounds like where people are going on the offensive, as if it's some kind of game that they're playing, which of course, in a way it is. So I was just wondering about that. I was wondering how often you see that at the national level, and Roger, if you've ever seen that kind of thing on the state level as well, people purposefully misleading legislators. That was new information to me.
I certainly see a lot more happening at the state level than at the federal level, because you have congressional staff like Angus that can essentially separate out the BS from the non-BS. But certainly I've seen a preponderance of that at the state level, and I think there's a reason for that, which is at the end, there's a bunch of stuff you can certainly do at the federal level, but certainly in our industry, a lot happens at the state level. The feds do not own the polls. There are private companies in Maine that own the polls. And those private companies are governed by certain legislative laws, albeit they need to evolve and change, and GW has been trying to do that for 25 years. But the way the citizen legislature, because it is a citizen legislature, right? I mean, these are men and women that are trying to do their best, and they're trying to learn some really complicated stuff. And there is a very intentional effort by federal entities, I would say nationwide entities, that will helicopter in and just essentially put this disinformation on their laps. It's enormously hard for these men and women to say, this is actually bunk. It's really, really hard. So what happens is it gets through the committee, or it's at committee, and then there's a whole bunch of kerfuffles saying, okay, why is this here? And somebody says, well, this and such industry actually, champions this, and it seems okay. So, that's where the conversation then really starts to sort of morph itself into some negative turn. And then you spend a lot of energy trying to sort of, trying to overcome that. At the federal level, it's a different dynamic, because, you have staff that's able to sort of parse information. You have certain amount of resources, right? But at the state level, you don't, Amy. I mean, there's no way, especially if you're part of two committees, your nights and days are taken up reading reams and reams of paper. And this is old fashioned, by the way. When they get disinformation, it's not social media, it's mailers. It's people coming in giving you pieces of paper. This is very old fashioned, because they have money to do that. Literally have money to do that. They can send somebody and say, I'm going to sit with you and walk you through this piece of paper. I don't have that kind of time. I don't have that kind of bandwidth. So that's where the metastasization of public policy then starts to happen, because the reasons then are wrong.
Yeah, I agree with everything Karem just said. A little different perspective on some of it, though. Clearly, if a lobbyist flies in from a large telecom out of state, and I never met him before, I would take everything that person said with a grain of salt, because I don't know them. I don't know if I can trust the information they're given. But to the extent these companies hire lobbyists to do their work in the legislature, it's a small community, and you get to know these people very well, and they know darn well that the first time they actively mislead you on something is the last time you're going to ever trust them. So you kind of learn which lobbyists you can rely on and which you can't, and the answer is you can usually rely on most of them. Lobbyist is not necessarily a dirty word, particularly here in Maine. So they're going to certainly make their case in the most effective way, but actually misleading or lying, that's pretty rare. I think we see it more on particularly the issues that Karim's interested in or that we're talking about is in the referenda project where it's, Katie bar the door. And you take a look at the CMP corridor as an example.
Yeah.
I mean, a huge amount of money coming in favor of the corridor. And I no position on the corridor, but a huge amount of money coming in favor of it, coming from the out of state and even out of country owner of Central Maine Power Company. And you think, well, what about the other side? Well, equally on the other side, you look, and once you dig down in, you're seeing huge amounts of money coming from oil and gas producers who don't want to, who don't want to see the project, and CMP on the other side saying they do want it. So I think the ethics of the referenda world are far worse in the state of Maine than actually within the legislature.
Well said, Roger. Well said.
I think if we can switch gears now, we heard from Amy a minute ago, but I think we're going to now ask Amy to tell us a little bit more about what Stand With Maine is up to here, and particularly in its relation with American Promise, as we all have a chance to think over what we've heard from Karim. Amy?
Right, well, thank you. First off, Jane Gallagher, the other co-leader of American Promise Maine, and I would just like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight and joining us. We appreciate everyone's time and interest in the topic of how political spending affects small businesses in Maine. And the goal of Stand With Maine is really to shine a spotlight on the cross-partisan resolution that Roger mentioned a little while ago, passed in 2013, which called for an amendment to the United States Constitution regarding campaign finance that would reaffirm, this is in quotations, reaffirm the power of citizens through their government to regulate the raising and spending of money in elections, end quote. And asked each member of Maine's congressional delegation actively to promote such an amendment. This resolution means that Maine is ready to ratify an amendment to the Constitution that would allow the US Congress and states to set reasonable limits on campaign spending in US elections. There are 19 additional states that have passed either a resolution or a referendum to date, for a total of 20 so far. We're grateful for Senator King's support in his efforts to get big money out of politics. And once again, we'd like to thank Edie Smith of his Bangor office for joining us on this call and letting the senator know about tonight's important discussion. Thank you, Edie. There are several ways to get involved with Stand With Maine by visiting our website, standwithmaine.net. First of all, if you are an individual, we would love to ask you to sign our petition, which is right in the middle of the homepage. Secondly, if you are a business owner or business leader or head of an organization in Maine, there's also an endorsement section on the website, and we would love you to consider endorsing Stand With Maine. We have a wide variety of groups supporting us so far, organizations like the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, and as well as the Maine chapters of the Sierra Club and the Citizens Climate Lobby, and some small businesses as well, including Dufour Tax Group, LT's Embroidery, Screenery, and Promotional Products, and my own business, Cartmel and Associates of Keller Williams. We would be happy to talk further, Jane or I, anytime with anyone who is wanting more information. And third, a recent poll conducted by Citizen Data on behalf of American Promise found that generally over 72% of likely Maine voters said they would support a proposed 28th Amendment. I say 28th Amendment because so far there are 27. Now another organization could beat us and become the 28th, but as it stands, we would be the 28th. But anyhow, over 72% of likely Maine voters said they would support such an amendment, and that would enact reasonable limits on campaign financing by corporations, unions, wealthy individuals, and outside money in elections, including support from 54% of Republicans, 86% of Democrats, and 61% of independents. The same poll found that educating voters on the subject was key to maximizing support. You know, not everybody has heard about this issue or realizes what a big impact it has on all of our lives, but you can help us get the word out by about Stand With Maine by joining our Maine chapter and sharing our work and our website with your friends and family. Our chapter meets via Zoom at 6:30 p.m. on the first and third Wednesdays of each month. Sometimes the meetings are calls like this. Oftentimes they're chapter members chatting about what we can do to get the word out. So just email me directly at acartmel@kw.com to join and participate in this democracy preserving effort. We would love to have you.
Well, thanks, Amy. And I'm struck by that 72% in this polarized world in which we're living. I don't know anything else that would get the support of 72% of people right across the board of all political stripes. So this is something which is ready to happen. And the issue is getting much more play in Maine recently. I don't know if people saw Bill Nemitz's article a week or so ago now on it. If you haven't, you might check it out. And it's various sectors of the world. It's the environmental community. It's the civic groups. It's organizations like the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. And as we heard from Karem tonight, it's small business here in Maine, and well, particularly innovative businesses like him. Karem, it was a real pleasure listening to you talk tonight. And in that spirit, I'm going to give you the last couple of minutes if you'd like to wrap things up.
Well, thank you so much to Stand With Maine, Amy, Azor, Betsy. Well, you know, Betsy, you know, we go way, way back. So thank you so much for having me. Really, sincerely, soulfully, thank you so much. It's hard having the last word, but what I would suggest is we are on a journey. And as a society, especially in Maine, in the 21st century, this journey has several generational implications. Not that journeys don't have generational implications, but this one is at that point where the price of not being intentional about what we want to do and what we want to be is enormously high. And it will stick around for a long, long time. And I think it's our responsibility as citizens to be involved, to say that I have a voice, to say that whether you are an immigrant or whether you are a second, third, fourth generation traveler that came to Maine from a long time ago, that we're all Mainers. That it's not a matter of you or me or the other, it's a matter of us. I think when it comes to gender equality and being able to say, and Betsy knows this, the ERA needs to become law. It needs to be a constitutional amendment. But these are elemental things that will define history in the long swath of things, especially if you think in terms of a geologic timescale. So what I would say is be true to what you want to see and bring that voice to bear, especially with your wallet, especially with your intelligence, and especially with your desire to affect change. Because I don't think that we can afford to sit on the back foot anymore. Because the days when the Republic functioned just because of its good graces are over. The Republic needs to function because people want it to function. And I am a product of having survived 2 dictatorships in Pakistan and Turkey. So I have a history of being able to survive a dictatorship. You don't want to survive a dictatorship. You don't want to survive the loss of your vote. You don't want to survive the loss of being labeled as a nobody. You don't want to survive the loss of not being a participant in the good things that what a human society does. And so if we want to change the economy in Maine, if we want to create more jobs, if you want to be equal, if you want to have everybody essentially be included in that journey, we have to get involved. And so, do the best you can. Don't give up, because I tell you, on the other side, when it does happen, it's magical. It really is magical. And I'm a statistical proof of that. You survive those things, you can do a whole bunch of things because you get blessed with friends, family, peers, colleagues, like all of you here. And now you become part and parcel of a community, and that community now has leverage. So,
Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your inspiration. And this has been a wonderful hour, and I'm sure everybody who's been on would agree with that. So thank you so much for being here. And that is going to end this meeting. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Karam.
Thank you, everyone. All right.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a good night. Be well.